Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to Juliet and Kathy for their fantastic presentations as well in terms of setting the scene. I've been asked to talk about education because obviously that is where most children access their rights out with the home. And, you know, referring back to Juliet's comments around General Comment 19, in terms of the goals of education, you'd be looking at General Comment 1. So unfortunately, there isn't a nice child-friendly version of it, but it is very interesting to read, and it does very clearly set out that broad purpose of education. It is not just about 8 curriculum areas. It really does bring together that idea about the right to learn and use your language, the right to an education, generally speaking, an education that develops your personality, talents and abilities to the full, to play, leisure, facilities, recreation, all of these sort of things. But you'd need to go and look at it in more detail, but it's certainly worthwhile a look because it is an eye-opener. Okay, so in terms of that, I'm going to start by setting the scene a bit in terms of education. And by education, I don't just mean schools, although I will focus on that a little bit more further on. Education happens not just in the home, but also in community learning and development settings, in early learning and childcare, and of course in schools and in other places too, such as libraries. But these are some of the key policy documents, guidance and self-evaluation that already exist. So I'm going to start here with realising the ambition, a really key early years setting piece of guidance, which definitely upholds children's rights. GERFEC has already been mentioned by Kathy, getting it right for every child. But again, we need to be mindful of the fact that GERFEC came from the articles of the UNCRC, and sometimes we will come across a misunderstanding that it's the other way around. Support for learning all our children and all their potential, the additional support for learning review, and over here the promise, which was the independent care review, both very much emphasise the importance of listening to children and having cognizance of children's rights. I'll come on to the curriculum in a moment. Here we've got learner participation in educational settings, which is a really good piece of professional learning that educational practitioners can access. It's not very well known, but I would strongly recommend it. It talks about the 4 arenas of participation, which I will come on to again shortly. And there are various other things: achieving excellence and equity, the National Improvement Framework and Improvement Plan, which applies to schools and early learning and childcare settings, has a new priority as of last year, which is placing the human rights and needs of every child and young person in the centre of education. And local authorities all have an obligation to report on that annually. And then the last one I'm going to talk to you is the putting the learners at the centre towards a future vision of the Scottish education. And this was the report pulled together by Professor Ken Muir in a response to the OECD report, which the Scottish Government then commissioned a response to. And he very much talks about Article 29 and the goals of education, and that our education system should absolutely be based around Article 29. Okay, so in terms of how does it fit in the curriculum as it stands now, unfortunately, it's not explicit in the 4 contexts that we have here, or the 4 capacities that we have here. It just isn't explicit. But that said, if you've got a curriculum that does this, and it provides good opportunities for personal achievement, it's got a really positive ethos and life of school as a community, the curriculum areas and subjects are meaningful and relevant, and interdisciplinary learning, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an approach where different subject areas will come together, and it's very much child-led. It's very much they plan it, they evaluate it, and they share their learning afterwards. So if all of those things are in place, then you should have a rights-based approach to your curriculum. These are the 4 arenas to participation that I was talking about before. So how do children and young people participate in making decisions around learning, teaching and assessment? How do they participate in opportunities for personal achievement, sometimes called wider achievement? How are they involved in decision-making groups within the school? And how are they involved in the wider community decision-making as well? Funnily enough, pre-COVID, that wider community thing was quite strong, and the learning, teaching and assessment wasn't. And it's kind of flipped around because of what's happened. not saying it's brilliant in learning teaching assessment, but it's better than it was. Okay, a couple of slides back, you'll have seen the GTC Scotland standards referenced as an underpinning policy. I didn't talk about it then because I want to talk about it a bit more now. Back in August 2021, the General Teaching Council for Scotland refreshed their standards. They had an extensive consultation process with children and young people, which is supported by Children in Scotland. And they came out with some very radically new standards, structured very differently. Children's rights are woven right through all of the strands, whether it's early career teachers, standard for full registration, middle leadership, or headship. And it's made clear that it's everybody's responsibility to uphold the rights of children and young people. And there are also a lot of linked themes in there, such as learning for sustainability, equalities, and inclusion. But these are just 3 that I've extracted from the professional values and personal commitment core to being a teacher. But there are many, many more throughout the standards. So that embracing global educational and social values, and that real recognition of children's rights, respecting the rights of all learners, we have to emphasise there, as outlined in the UNCRC, and their entitlement to be included in decisions regarding their learning experiences, and that, again, that entitlement to being supported. And on top of that, and this links back to general comment 1, as about respecting social, ecological, cultural, religious and racial diversity. And what I often ask practitioners is, what does that look like in practice? How would I see that if I went into your classroom? And that might be something that you want to reflect upon as well when you're having those conversations with education leads in your local authorities. What does it look like? However, it's not just, as I said, teachers. The SSC, the Scottish Social Services Council standards, which apply to all early years practitioners and social work staff, also reference rights, not just children's rights, because obviously social work staff don't just work with children, but we've got that reference there to rights of people who use the services, and again that reference to dignity. So that is really clear that we have to have that in our early years settings as well. And I mentioned earlier community learning and development. Again, it is something that is prevalent in their standards too. So we have a common language across our 3 main education bodies of children's rights. And that gives you that opportunity when you're looking at something from a child's rights point of view, and at that, go back to Kathy's slide about empty your brain and then start from children's rights. And I think that if we have those 3 people working with a family, then how do we all start from the point of view of children's rights? So in terms of what we've been doing in Education Scotland up till now, a lot of preparation and activities, professional learning offers, including an introduction to UNCRC, learner participation, obviously what we're doing today. There can be just opportunities to have discursive sessions, very bespoke inputs for particular groups such as Who Cares Scotland, and also sessions for parent groups as well, because I think it's really important. Parents can be anxious because they think this is taking away their rights. So if we can do more work with parents, they understand that it's actually the opposite, as Juliet said before. It actually upholds and enhances their rights. I give a lot of professional advice, and not just myself, but other colleagues link a range of professional learning to UNCRC. For example, one of our numeracy education officers has done some work around how does numeracy and maths in the curriculum link to the UNCRC, and it's really interesting, and other human rights treaties as well. We have a recognising and realising children's rights resource, but we can also deliver training around that if you don't want to do it yourselves as a school. We have various networks, Train the Trainers, Children's Rights and Participation. The Young Leaders of Learning programme is an interesting one. It's meant to encourage and support local authorities to involve children and young people in school improvement. So we've got around 10 local authorities in Scotland that are involved in that, but we need to have a commitment from the local authority to be involved. And then Kathy and I have had some initial discussions with initial teacher education institutions, which we are hoping to take forward again. It can be quite tricky because they are all different. But I think there's an appetite now for us to take that forward. So in terms of what is going well, internally within Education Scotland, my colleagues do have a much stronger understanding of UNCRC, although I think some of them roll their eyes when I start talking about it. And a lot of them are starting to link their own professional learning offers, advice, support with the UNCRC. There is a genuine willingness to engage with children and young people and actively seek their views, although it may not always be done correctly or in an appropriate way. We have made a lot of connections between the Additional Support for Learning Review, the Independent Care Review and the UNCRC, and simplified that so people don't see them as three separate things. And more recently, we started a lot of planning with the curriculum innovation team from both Education Scotland and Scottish Government to see how we can embed Article 29 in the approaches moving forward. Externally within the education system, we've had a huge amount of attendance at professional learning sessions. You can see the numbers are there, over 3,000 across over 150 sessions. I've stopped counting since August 2021. And these were just sessions that were delivered by myself, not those who have been involved in the trainers or other colleagues who also reference the UNCRC. We do get very positive course evaluations. There is an appetite for change. We've got great connections and networking. The use of technology to attend virtual training has been an absolute bonus and a real positive legacy from COVID, because if you're in a small school in Highland, it was absolutely impossible for you to access face-to-face training before. So it's been much more equitable. All of our regional improvement collaborators have identified UNCRC as an area for action. And Ken Muir's Putting the Learners at the Centre report, as I said before, recognises the need for Article 29 to be at the heart of learners' experiences. Curriculum is not about 8 subjects, especially as those 8 subjects have been pretty much the same for the last 150 years. Think back to when you went to school and have a look at them. Are they the same? And as I mentioned before about the GTCS standards promoting a rights-based approach. So the challenges, there always are some, aren't they? A lack of awareness of how UNCRC can and should underpin all work with children. It can be seen as an add-on, something extra. But my mantra is, if you're doing something that does not uphold the UNCRC and you're working with children and young people, why are you doing it? A lack of understanding, particularly in schools, of what a rights-based approach is. It can be about learning the articles of the convention, putting nice posters up on the wall. And that can actually be problematic, because if children learn they've got these rights, but then they're not able to access them because of the way they're treated, then they obviously become somewhat disengaged. There can be a capacity issue. There shouldn't be if you're not seeing it in a siloed way, but that is perception. And there's also a perception of confidence. People think it's more complicated than it is. It's not complicated to keep children happy and safe and healthy. Again, we're not seeing the links. In many schools, you'll have a coordinator for developing the young workforce, what's the matter with my speech? A coordinator for learning for sustainability, a coordinator for creativity in the curriculum, and so on. And they don't get together and see all of these things are underpinned by the UNCRC and they're all connected. So that is a problem, and we therefore get schools saying, well, we can't do children's rights this year because we're doing DYW. We can't do inclusion because we're doing creativity, and they don't see how they're all linked. So that's a lot of work we're doing on that at the moment. A lot of institutionalised approaches to issues such as discipline, which undermine dignity, and Kathy alluded to that a little bit before it as well. And again, are we doing these things because they uphold rights, or because we've always done them and they suit the institution of the setting? We don't have to think about it very much. That's what we've always done. We've always had detention because it's easy, even though we're ignoring the fact that it's always the same children in detention. And again, looking for quick fixes, thinking that if we introduce children's rights, everything's going to be perfect overnight in our school. That's not going to be. But particularly when gathering views of children and young people, you know, I will get people, colleagues coming to me and say, have you got a group of young people you can go and ask about this policy next week? And I'm just, well, no, because they don't know anything about the policy. They haven't any understanding. They might not even be interested in it. And it's not been strategically thought through. You need to start planning much further back. And a real lack of understanding of what effective learner participation looks like at every single level. At local authority level, it can be around, we have a parliament of learners who are usually post 14 at least, come from affluent areas, articulate, who can travel into a central location and give some feedback or comment. It's not about going into their settings and talking to them. And at school level, it can be very much about, we've got a pupil council, so we've ticked that box. But we're not thinking about how do we involve learners in decision making in the classroom and about their own learning and teaching. How do we involve them in decision making in their local communities? So to be a bit depressing in the next couple of slides, but we have to be realistic about what some of the problems are. Toilets, a huge thing, and you see things in the press about this all the time, and the solution is often, well, we'll just lock them. And I know there can be concerns about vandalism or time wasting, but to me, if a young person is wanting out of a class because they're going to the toilet to get out of class, then why are they wanting out? What's the problem within that learning setting that's meaning they want to escape from it? Is the learning right for them? Is the curriculum right for them? Is it somebody that's next to them in the classroom? Is it that they're anxious about something, they're needing a time out space, and that's the only place they can go to? There can be a number of reasons. So it's about investigating what those reasons are, as well as agreeing with children and young people across the school some solutions, not just locking the toilets or having toilet passes or whatever it may be. We had a whole issues around outdoor jackets during COVID, when it was freezing. Teacher was sitting there with a jacket on, learners weren't. Stand outside the classroom for whole periods is a form of punishment, serious infringement there in terms of education. Josh is the one that I find most puzzling. This was from an initial teacher education tutor who was in observing a student teacher. So the class are all settled and Josh has his hood up, but he's quiet, he's engaging, he's learning, he's not disrupting anyone. The head teacher comes in, shouts at him to take his hood down, disrupts the whole class, and then for the whole of the rest of that day, Josh no longer engages with his learning. What I fail to understand in the first place is why a head teacher would go into a classroom when there's a student crit going on. But that aside, having done so, this is such an inappropriate way to behave and such an infringement of children's rights, both in terms of Josh, but the whole class whose learning is interrupted. And then again, we've got a few more examples on this page as well. But one that worries me most is that third one about the pupil being screamed at by a teacher to such an extent that the student teacher who had observed that would have reported it as a safeguarding concern had it been a parent behaving in that way. But because it was a teacher, it wasn't reported to anybody at all. I know about it because they were talking to me, and I don't know who these schools are, they're all different schools, but that is quite a concern that that kind of behaviour is going on, and this is recent. I don't know, Kathy, that you've had raised concerns several times about shouting in schools, and it's still deemed to be acceptable in many schools. And I'm not saying these things happen in all schools all of the time, they don't, but they are still too common. However, there are some positives, and I know you talked about trauma-informed practice and things before, but we have restorative approaches in many schools, and as long as restorative approaches are done properly, and it's not just about the learner apologises to the teacher, then they are very effective. Person-centred planning, which can be called different things in different local authorities, but things such as individual education plans, as long as the learner is at the centre of that plan and is involved in that plan. Interdisciplinary learning, which I explained before about having those very engaging approaches to project-based learning. Embedding equity and inclusion, we have a circle resource in Education Scotland, which really helps to embed that across primary and secondary settings. The Compassionate and Connected Classroom, which is a resource for upper primary and lower secondary to help children, young people to develop empathy. And of course, nurture approaches, again, if they're done properly. Nurture is not about a room, it's about an attitude, it's about where you treat people. But you'll have many others that you're using in your schools. But the main question is, are these actually being referenced as rights-based approaches? Because if you're doing these things, you've already got some really strong rights-based approaches in your educational settings, but you have to make that explicit and make it clear. It's not necessarily about doing something extra. It's just about recognising that a lot of the things you already do are absolutely rights-based, and making that clear both to parents, colleagues and learners. And I'm going to stop there.